Welcome to part 3 of my series on Miles Mathis's paper, Lincoln's Assassination Was Also a Manufactured Event. Let's just jump right back where we left off from part 2. All the evidence leads us to the conclusion that they had no body, which means the president was never there, which means no one was shot, which means the entire account is fiction. We don't even have any evidence Booth was there. If all the rest of this is fiction, why believe Booth was there, jumped down, and fled, etc.? Even if we assume that there was some sort of real event that night, and that the whole thing wasn't just fed to the newspapers wholesale, we can get the same story without bothering to include Booth at all. The entire audience could have been planted. Just tell anyone who wants a ticket that night that the show is sold out. Then partially fill the theater with military and government personnel, especially intelligence people, and run whatever event you like. To fool people on the street, you may wish to actually have the guards running in and clearing the theater. You may wish to have a body carried across the street to Peterson's and so on. But all the rest can be achieved with a pen. You just write it down and send it to the newspapers and the job is done. We even have some proof of the above scenario, since although the president was supposed to be in attendance at this very popular play, the theater was about 1/3 empty. You may wish to compare that to the flights on 9/11, which were mysteriously only 1/3 full. It looks like the government didn't have enough trustworthy personnel on hand to fill the 2,400 seats in Ford's theater. Addendum, May 29, 2019. One of my readers tripped across supporting evidence of Lincoln's faked death while at his bank. He was reading a book there entitled The History of J.P. Morgan and Chase Company when he tripped across this admission. Abraham Lincoln was Springfield Marine and Fire Insurance Company's most famous customer. He opened an account at the bank in 1853 while practicing law in Springfield, Illinois. Lincoln's account was particularly active in the years leading up to his election as U.S. President in 1860. He remained a customer throughout his presidency until his death in 1865. The account was closed 2 years later. Note the part about the account being closed 2 years later. We are told the will was in probate for 2 years as well, but we can now read this as indication Abe lived another 2 years. Why else would his insurance account stay open 2 years after his death, or his will be in probate for that long? This also reminds us that with so many other events we have covered, think of the Titanic, insurance fraud may have been part of the story here. As we have seen in the papers after this one, these families like nothing better than a big insurance fraud, especially if it includes a fake death. It is seen as the easiest of money, other than selling modern art. I suppose a lot more could be said on this event, and I may return to it later, but I feel I have already shown you the main evidence. In my opinion, the murder is solved. There was no murder. If you aren't convinced, or at least intrigued by now, I doubt you ever will be. I will only take a moment to answer a couple of questions and tie up a couple of loose ends. Some will ask me, what happened to Booth? Did he escape from the barn and all that? Well, no. There never was any barn, and no one was ever killed in that event either. There was just another faked and planted story. The body they used was of a Confederate soldier, already dead. Kenzie and Zegan swore that the body they saw at Garrett's farm wore a gray uniform and yellow brogans and had a red mustache. They knew that Booth had shaved his mustache because they had already visited Dr. Mudd, who had told them that himself. Andrew Potter tells much the same story. We have been told by alternate theorists that Booth escaped to Texas or India or somewhere, but I don't believe it. The reason I don't believe it is that I know Booth was Union intelligence. I also know he was very wealthy and famous. He already had a great life, so to convince him to sell out his name and reputation and future would be very difficult or impossible. I simply don't believe he was that patriotic. Given what we have discovered, the best guess is that he didn't agree to it. Remember, always check off the most likely things first before moving on to the less likely. Since we have seen that Lincoln was not where we are told he was, we should assume Booth was also not where we are told he was. They could only use Booth's name in this event because he was already gone. Like Lincoln, he was gone long before the event even started. It is conceivable Booth switched sides sometime in late 1864. He had been hanging out with intelligence assets from both sides for years, pretending to be Confederate while actually being Union. It is possible he got a great offer from the South and moved down there. But I think it is much more likely he got caught in his own schemes and was murdered by Southern agents while in costume and under an alias. Because he was under an assumed name, they didn't know they had killed John Wilkes Booth. They just buried him. Those in Union intelligence discovered Booth had been murdered as a spy at the same time they were working on the fake assassination. They needed a fall guy, so they decided to use Booth. They simply neglected to publicize his death. To buy time, they made up a story about him going to Canada for a while. You will say he was seen in plays up until March 1865. Maybe he was, maybe he wasn't. That fake is also very easy to pull off. You hire an actor who looks like Booth and pay the local theater critic to say he was smashing. Only a few smart people in the audience figure it out. Okay, but do we have any evidence for this theory? In fact, we do. We have a photo of the three Booth brothers acting in Julius Caesar in late 1864. Unfortunately, that is an obvious paste-up. It is fake. How do I know? Simple research and a good eye. That is supposed to be John to the left, Edwin in the middle, and Junius to the right. Even without examining the photo closely, we know it again contradicts the mainstream story. By 1864, Edwin and John are supposed to be totally estranged. We are told that Edwin would neither talk nor work with John. So how did they convince them to work together here? They didn't. John wasn't in the play, and that photo is fake. Did you know that Junius was 17.5 years older than John and 12 years older than Edwin? He should have been a month shy of 44 here, while John was just 26. Is that how it looks to you? It isn't how it looks to me, but there is much more. Let's look at some real photos from that time of these guys. That's what real professional photos of the time look like. Compare them to the photo above. See a problem? If you don't, I will point out a few for you. Look how small Edwin's foot is compared to his head. Look at John's arm. Why is it so short and so white? Now compare the black tones in Edwin to the black tones in John. The hair is a good place to compare, but you can compare all the blacks in the eyes, robe, and sandals. See how Edwin is darker overall than John? John's blacks are all 2 steps grayer, aren't they? Now look at the shadows beneath the 3 men. Although there are shadows under the other 2 men, there is no shadow under John. You will say it is because his skirt is higher, but look at the little dark lines around his feet. Even those small shadows don't match the other guys. The blacks aren't black enough. There are no shadows falling to the right, as from his raised heel. The focus of the whole photograph appears off as well. Do you think they paid a photographer to come in and take pictures of them in costume only to release this one that is out of focus? No, the photographer takes a set of photos, and one will surely be better quality than this. Whoever released this fake photo back in the day purposely released it in low resolution to help hide the paste seams and other anomalies. I would say all 3 heads have been pasted on. As just a start, notice the halos around all 3 heads. It is especially obvious with John. Look at the light band around his hair to the left. This tampering with a famous photo is proof John wasn't there. If he wasn't there, where was he? Why were they faking his whereabouts in late 1864? This strongly supports the death hypothesis. He was too famous and too handsome to disappear in the South or West at that time, especially with his picture in all the papers. and he would not have wanted to disappear anyway. He had it too good where he was. You will say no reward was offered for Booth beyond April 26, but reward or no reward, a lot of people hated Booth. Many knew there was a question mark over his death. He wouldn't have been safe anywhere in the US, much less comfortable. That's why I don't think he would agree to having his name used, not even for a large sum of money. He already had money and fame and comfort. They would have had to move him overseas, but why would he want to go overseas? Even Europe wouldn't be safe. It wasn't safe for Surratt, as we have seen, and Surratt was much less famous and much less handsome and much less wanted. Booth wouldn't wish to move to India or South America or anywhere else, since that would be a big step down for him, no matter how much money he was offered, and I don't see him agreeing to be used for this job. The people who agree to relocations are people who aren't doing well where they are. But Booth had it made. He was rich, handsome, famous, working for Union intelligence, and about to wed a senator's daughter. There is no logical way to explain this except that he was already dead and they just borrowed his name. Addendum, January 2nd, 2016. John Wilkes Booth may have been Jewish. It is not my research that discovered that. It is in the new book on Lincoln by Sarna and Shapel, who are Jewish themselves, and in the testimony of Booth's sister Asia and brother Edwin. Both stated that their father was Jewish, attending synagogue and speaking Hebrew. The authors also admit that the Lincolns attended a performance of The Merchant of Venice in which John Wilkes Booth played Shylock. Why is that worth mentioning? Because Shylock was a Jewish banker. So there you have it. We have passed through the bog and come out the other side. I think you will admit that this theory, though astonishing at first read, is actually much less extreme than most other alternative theories of Lincoln's death. Because the mainstream story was seen to be full of holes from the beginning, the alleged assassination has generated mountains of speculation. Those who have studied these theories know that just about everything imaginable has been proposed to fill these holes. I think my explanation is far simpler, far more logical, in that it fits the known facts far more gracefully. And although it points the finger at hidden players, it points to hidden players we know were there. We know military intelligence was active during the Civil War. Intelligence wasn't invented in 1947. So the involvement of intelligence is the natural first assumption, not the involvement of esoteric international cabals. Even if we accept the existence of esoteric international cabals, they are not needed here. We have explained it without them. You may or may not wish to insert them wherever I talk about powers behind Lincoln, but that is beyond the purview of this paper. Faking a murder is well within the capabilities of local intelligence, even a murder of this prominence. In fact, most of the alternate theories look like purposeful misdirection to me, simply because they failed to consider the most likely answers first. In any real investigation, an investigator crosses off the simplest and most likely scenarios first, proceeding to the less likely ones only when those simpler ones fail to fit the evidence. When an investigator of a murder comes across a mountain of evidence of tampering and fakery and lies, his first question should be, was there a murder at all? Only when he is convinced of the murder itself does he proceed to ask further questions. Given the story we have been told, we should never have been convinced of the murder of Lincoln. We never had any real evidence for it. All the evidence we have is clearly pushed. So we should then look for evidence he wasn't murdered. As it turns out, there is actually a lot of that evidence, buried just below the top layer of falsehoods. I recommend you remember that when looking into any subsequent events. My simple method is useful when looking at any murder, and you can now apply it to hundreds or thousands of famous cases to see if they hold up. Addendum, August 27th, 2016. I just found an entire layer I missed the first time. It required a very close and extended study of the genealogy charts in the mid-1800s, which I later ended up doing as part of the research for many later papers, including my paper on Lizzie Borden, my paper on F. Scott Fitzgerald, and so on. Only by cross-referencing these many genealogy searches was I able to discover that all these families are closely related. That is to say, as that research relates to this paper, we find the Todds were related to the Surratts. They were also related to the Booths, Parkers, and Rathbones. So we find more evidence this was all an inside job. They choose people from their own families to play the parts in this hoax. Remember, Henry Rathbone was the one who allegedly fought with Booth in the theater box before the shot was fired. 2 Surratts were among the alleged conspirators, so you should find it highly suspicious to discover all these people were closely related, mainly through Lincoln's wife, Mary Todd. The genealogy sites have scrubbed the first layer of relationships, so it is not obvious on a first glance. However, once you discover the connecting families, you can make the links indirectly. For instance, the link to Rathbone wasn't made for me until my paper on Mabel Dodge Lewin, where I discovered her great-grandmother Lucy Anderson had married twice, once to John Ganson and once to Israel Rathbone. Israel's father and Henry's grandfather were brothers. The Rathbones were also related to the Reeds. See Lydia Rathbone, who married William Reed. Henry Rathbone's full name was Henry Reed Rathbone. That links us to my paper on John Reed as well. The Rathbones were also related to the Burroughs/Burroughs. See Elizabeth Rathbone, who married Amos Burroughs. That links us to my paper on the Beat Poets, and William S. Burroughs, among many others. That links the Rathbones to the Gansons, but how does it link them to this paper? Well, the Gansons were also related to the Gates, as I showed in my paper on Mabel Dodge Lewin. So were the Rathbones. Isaiah Rathbone married Molly Gates. Isaiah was the half-brother of the Rathbones. One of his descendants was Horatio Gates Spafford Rathbone, father of Edna Chapman. Anyway, the Gates were related to the Todds. See Sarah Todd, who married George William Gates Sr. in around 1830. This Gates was the son of Jerusha Russell Clark, which ties us to the Clark and Russell families as well. We saw the Russells involved in the Lizzie Borden hoax. So the Rathbones were related to the Todds through the Gates. The Rathbones were also related to the Booths. To discover this, I had to trip across a book in Google Books called A History of the Old Town of Stratford and the City Bridgeport, Volume 2. See page 1331 to 332. There we find Reverend Isaiah Wetmore, dated 1798, marrying a Phoebe Walker of Stratford, Connecticut. His mother was Sarah Booth. Their last son, Charles, married Elizabeth Rathbone, daughter of John Rathbone of New York. What about the Surratts? We have seen that the Surratts were related to the Fitzgeralds. That is admitted in F. Scott Fitzgerald's bio. They were also related to the Scotts and Keys. Susanna Scott Key's daughter, Mary Hunter, married John Surratt. Beyond that, Mary Surratt's mother was Elizabeth Webster, which brings that family into it as well. The Surratts were also related to the Jacobs. See Alatia Surratt, who married Jan Jacobs in about 1825. This ties into my Leo DiCaprio paper. Anyway, I send you first to the genealogy of Joseph Wilkes Todd, father of Harvey Webster Todd. That sort of kills 2 birds with 1 stone, since you see the link to both Wilkes and Webster there. You can also see the marriage of William Webster and Mary Ann Todd in about 1855. Then we have Edith Webster Todd, daughter of Theron Todd and Hattie Webster. While we are here, I thought I would remind you that Daniel Webster's granddaughter, Carolyn Appleton, married Jerome Napoleon Bonaparte II. His grandfather was the brother of Napoleon, which of course ties us to my paper on him. Daniel Webster's mother was an Eastman, and we have seen that name come up many times as well, most recently in my paper on Lizzie Borden. Lizzie's mother was a Morse, and we found Eastmans in her recent ancestry. There were also Eastmans involved in the Salem witch trial. We have seen the Clark family come up already. Well, the Booths were related to the Clarks. See Asia Frigga Clark. She was the sister of John Wilkes Booth and the wife of John Sleeper Clark. Curiously, he took his mother's name instead of his father's. He was born John Clark Sleeper. His mother, Georgiana Clark, has been thoroughly scrubbed, indicating they are hiding something very important. But not hiding it well, because the name Clark is enough. It ties us to the Todds once again, since Mary Todd Lincoln's brother was named George Rogers Clark Todd. He was named for George Rogers Clark, son of Captain William Clark of Lewis and Clark fame. The Todds were also related to the Owens. George Rogers Clark Todd's grandfather was Levi Todd, son of David Todd and Hannah Owens. This links us to my paper on Frederick Engels and Robert Owen, two of the founders of communism. Also useful is the genealogy of James Clark Todd of the Kentucky Todds, early 1800s. He married Maria Blair, and their son was Lyman Beecher Todd. He married Sarah Swift in about 1850. She was the daughter of Stephen Swift and Louisa Tarbell. We just saw the Tarbells come up in my paper on Lizzie Borden, where the ex-governor of Massachusetts was George Robinson. He was her defense attorney. He was also descended from Tarbells. But it gets better. Stephen Swift's mother was named Thankful Whore, not a joke. We saw that surname in my paper on F. Scott Fitzgerald. Scott's editor was Maxwell Perkins, whose mother was Whore. There was a Dorcas Whore at the Salem witch trials. Thankful Whore's mother was Susanna Pierce, and we saw that surname in my paper on Lizzie Borden, related to all those people. We can also pull in a Jackson, since Stephen Swift's grandmother was Anne Jackson. This probably ties them to President Andrew Jackson, among others. Anyway, Jeannie breaks the line of James Clark Todd giving us no father. They also appear to give an incorrect date for his birth of 1804 to throw us off. But if we change that date to 1802, we find another James Clark Todd in the same place at the same time. And this man's parents are given as General Levi Todd and Jan Briggs, tying us back into the line of George Rogers Clark Todd. This proves the name Clark is not an accident. It is a family name indicating, despite all the scrubbings, a tie between the Clarks and the Todds. In fact, we find two more James Clark Todds. Samuel Blair Todd had a son and grandson of that name, and the first of these James Clark Todds married Mary Boone Bryan of the famous Bryans. See William Jennings Bryan, who took part in the fake Scopes monkey trial. Her great-grandmother was Sarah Russell. She is scrubbed, but she may be from the Russell family we saw in the Lizzie Borden hoax. If we follow these Bryans in the Todd genealogy, we find some of them changed their names to Bergen in around 1915. That's curious and may tell us something about the famous Bergens after that. These Bryans also give us another important link. Mary Boone Bryan's great-grandfather was Daniel Boone Bryan, and his wife's mother was Catherine Scott. She was the daughter of Joseph and Eleanor and the sister of John. This links the Scotts to the Todds, linking Francis Scott Key to Abraham Lincoln, a relationship the mainstream says does not exist. Of course, it also links the Surratts to the Todds once again, since it is admitted that the Scotts and Surratts are related. Now, what about that drunken policeman John Frederick Parker, who was allegedly next door at a pub while Abe was getting himself assassinated? He was also later the personal guard of Mary Todd Lincoln at the White House, indicating some relationship we aren't being told. Hold on to your hat, because this is the closest relationship of all. Mary Todd Lincoln's mother was Anne Elizabeth Parker. She had a brother, Archibald Parker, who is listed as having no children. John could have been his son. Mary Todd Lincoln had a great-uncle named John Parker, and his son was also named John Parker. His grandfather and great-grandfather were named John Thomas Parker. The most recent of those, John Parker, born 1797, is scrubbed as you would expect. But again, he could have had a son, and that son being our John Frederick Parker. We find John Frederick Parker's bio scrubbed as well. But when you are told he wasn't related to the Parkers in Mary Todd's line, you shouldn't believe it. Do you really think it is just a coincidence that this suspicious drunken policeman had the same name as 4 of Mary Todd's close relatives? Studying the Parker lines gives us yet another link. Mary Todd's great-grandfather was James Parker, and his sister was Lucy Parker. She married Charles Keyes, which is of course just a variation of Key. Some of the family later dropped the S. This once again links the Todds and the Keys, which not only links Francis Scott Key to Abraham Lincoln again, it links Lincoln to the Surratts one more time. It is also worth mentioning that Mary Todd's sister Elizabeth married Ninian Wirt Edwards. His brother was Albert Gallatin Edwards, who was Assistant Secretary of the Treasury under Lincoln. We are told he was named for Albert Gallatin, treasurer under Jefferson and Madison, but he was actually related to him. Like many others, this Albert Gallatin is sold to us as Swiss. If you believe that, I don't know what to say. Have your eyes checked. Maybe this little song will jog your memory. You've got to pick a pocket or two. His real first name was Abraham. He was a wealthy merchant from a family of wealthy merchants and is obviously Jewish, which is why I thought him worth adding here. It reminds us all these people were Jewish. Gallatin's second wife was Hannah Nicholson. The Nicholsons were related to the Edwards through the Beals. See Thomas Nicholson Beale, 1797, Maryland, for one example. Beale's mother's surname is scrubbed, but my guess is it is Nicholson. The Beals and Edwards intermarried many times in the same period, indicating Albert Gallatin Edwards wasn't just named for Albert Gallatin. He was a great-nephew or something. But let us back up a bit. I hope you also noticed the middle name of Ninian Wirt Edwards. Remember Wirt, Walker, related to George Bush? That is no coincidence. Wirt Walker's third grandfather was Solomon Walker, who married heiress Charity Stevens, granddaughter of Elihu Stevens. So we are looking at more crypto-Jews here. Either this Solomon Walker or his father previously married a Sylvia Delano. These Delanos were partners in Russell and Company, apparently an arm of the East India Company, which imported opium from China. The Delano family later spit out Franklin Delano Roosevelt, among others. Russell and Company links us to my recent paper on Lizzie Borden. Since a Russell was governor of Massachusetts at the time, he was related to Samuel Russell of Russell and Company and also to William Russell, who founded Skull and Bones. The Walkers and Bushes were and are Skull and Bones. The Forbes and the Alsops were also involved, both in Skull and Bones as in investors in the Walker Enterprises, and we have seen them recently as well, especially in my papers on John Forbes Nash and Nathaniel Hawthorne. The name Ninian Wirt Edwards tells us that the current John Edwards, John Kerry, and the Bushes are all related. They are also related to the Roosevelts. They admit some of these relationships, but try to spin them as very distant. They aren't very distant. I have found in my research that they hire some fake genealogists to tell us their relationships are something like 16th cousins 10 times removed, when they are actually 4th cousins twice removed or something. In other words, they point you to a common ancestor in Europe in 1600, overlooking the common ancestor in the US in about 1850. The Delano link above takes you to a 2010 paper by 9/11 truther Kevin Ryan, where we learn something else interesting. Solomon Walker's son, James Monroe Walker, was president of the Chicago, Burlington, and Quincy Railroad in the mid-1800s. He also controlled the Union Stockyards, the Kansas City Stockyards, and the Wilmington Coal Company. Finally, he was involved in Russell and Company, the trader in opium that was backed by many of the billionaires of the time. It was opium money that financed these other ventures. In these projects, Walker worked with Nathaniel Thayer and Sidney Bartlett. Sidney and Jonathan Bartlett are mentioned many times in the papers of banker Selman Chase. This is because Russell and Company was just an arm of the giant merchant banks, including Baring Brothers and N.M. Rothschild. I propose there is a link between Bartlett and Rothschild, based on admittedly circumstantial evidence. But what we are finding here supports that link. A further search on Sidney Bartlett takes us here, where we learn much about the family. Apparently, Sidney Bartlett had a son or brother named William S. Bartlett, who was a very wealthy Orange County banker. He had a grandson or nephew, Lanier Bartlett, who was a Hollywood screenwriter and Los Angeles Times reporter, and a grandson named Sidney Lanier Bartlett, who was a bon vivant. This last Bartlett briefly married the actress Ursula Cheshire. He was also U.S. Vice Consul in Casablanca and a spy. I found no direct link from him to Beau Bartlett, but I did find some indirect links. For a start, Beau's real name is James William Bartlett III. Here we find a Sidney Bartlett, born 1894, to James William Bartlett. And here we find a James William Bartlett with a brother and sister named Israel. Anyway, back to the Edwards line. In about 1800, the Edwards married into both the Green and Warfield families. Lucretia Edwards married General Duff Green of Maryland. Rachel Edwards married William Warfield of Maryland. We have seen both in recent papers. John Reed's grandfather was a Green. His bio is scrubbed. Wallis Simpson, Duchess of Windsor, was actually Bessie Warfield. We saw the Warfields in my paper on F. Scott Fitzgerald. The Edwards were also related to the Muses. Hayden Edwards, of this line, was the son-in-law of Mary Muse. We saw the Muses in my paper on Eustace Mullins, whose mother was a Muse, which brings us to the other thing I showed in that paper. The Muses were related to the Booths, which links the Booths to all these families one more time. To reiterate, what I have just shown you is that Abraham Lincoln was closely related to most of the major conspirators in his faked assassination. It was a family affair. This of course acts as more strong evidence the whole story was manufactured by these families to sell another one of their hoaxes. Much more research could and should be done on these linking genealogies, and I suspect I will continue to expose it in upcoming papers. Every paper I write tends to take us back to these same families who are at the center of the long lie now sold as history. For some, this essay has likely been overly long already, but for those whose eyes are still in their heads, I have a few more comments. I will remove the investigator's cap and change my tone a bit for this. I still won't act the historian, since I was never interested in straight reportage. I will put on the cap of the philosopher or legislator. After discovering what I have discovered, it occurred to me that I wasn't feeling the disgust I might be expected to feel from this whole charade. In fact, I found I was more offended by the vote stealing in the election of 1864, what with the requirement of oaths and so on, than I was by the faked assassination. With the faked murder, I felt I could understand the need for it, due to circumstances. It was a magnificent fraud, assuredly, and I would never defend fraud. And yet, I could see so clearly why and how it happened. That I was tempted to pass part of the blame to the framers of the Constitution who, through sheer negligence, one supposes, allowed it to occur. It was a disaster waiting to happen, and in fact this wasn't the only time it happened. As we have seen above, the vague wording of Article 1 set this whole thing up. So let us study the problem and the solution. It appears the authors of the Constitution didn't wish to allow a president to resign due to ill health or other reasons. They appeared to have assumed, for reasons that aren't really clear, that no president would simply wish to quit. They wrote Article 1 assuming ill health would either lead to a cure or to death, and they included language to cover both possibilities. But they didn't foresee a third possibility, lingering ill health that would not lead to death, but that would lead to the permanent inability to govern. They also didn't foresee that even ill health lingering for a short time could cause a crisis in times of emergency, since an acting president would not have the authority of a full president. and they clearly didn't foresee how loopholes in the rules of Article 1 would lead to exploitation of these loopholes, which is precisely what happened in 1865. It appears they didn't want a president just passing the ball to the vice president for no reason, since that would have allowed a candidate to get into office on false pretenses, by a sort of Cyrano gambit. But the only thing they did to prevent that was make it impossible for a president to just retire without scandal. Under the current language and customs, any retirement not due to ill health would be seen as scandalous and would negatively affect the vice president as he became president. We saw that with Ford, as he succeeded Nixon. Therefore, to successfully run a Cyrano gambit, pretending you are running one candidate while really running the other, they have to fake the death of the president. That allows the new president to govern with augmented authority rather than diminished authority. That is what we just saw in the above analysis. Now, the Constitution is a wonderful document in many ways, but in other ways it is a terrible document. Its vagueness on many issues is sold to us as strength, but in most cases it is nothing but a weakness. The Constitution is mainly a piece of legislation, and vagueness in legislation is never a plus. The brevity of the Constitution is admirable, but it could be almost as brief and 10 times as powerful, with the right wording. The authors of the Constitution did not take full account of human nature, by which any loophole is sure to be exploited. Admitting that, vague language should be avoided at all costs, and any loophole discovered later should be immediately filled. This has simply not happened. The loopholes have been exploited with ever more fantastic gambits. To prevent this Cyrano gambit, you could do one of two things. Most instances would be stopped by adding a clause to the effect that any president who dies or quits for any reason not due to scandal in the first year of office will not be succeeded by the vice president. The vice president will become acting president only while a special election is called. This special election must be called immediately, and in fact no one has to call it. As soon as the president dies or resigns, the election is understood to be called already by the Constitution itself. The actual voting should take place within 6 weeks, in times of war 3 weeks. All instances of the gambit could be prevented by extending the clause over all 4 years instead of just the first year. If I have still missed something, what I missed should also be filled with precise language. I will be told that these quick special elections don't allow time for the public to learn about candidates, but that argument is mostly a diversion. The public now has 2 years of campaigning to endure, and at the end learns almost nothing of value. If campaigns were honest, you could learn everything you needed to know about candidates in a matter of weeks. In dishonest campaigns, you will be prevented from learning anything to the point regardless. Short campaigns therefore limit the amount of possible propaganda, and are to be preferred for that alone. Amendment 25 was added to the Constitution in 1967 to clarify Article 1, but it fails to do so. It clarifies a couple of minor issues, but does nothing to close the big loopholes. There are easy solutions to most constitutional problems, but no one seems interested in discovering or implementing them. The Constitution is normally seen as either sacrosanct or just a stupid piece of paper. It is neither. Any loopholes discovered should be immediately and completely filled, lest fraud ultimately run rampant as it has. Another problem is that the Constitution rarely sets penalties. This again encourages fraud. To see what I mean, let us look at the problem of voter fraud, of which we saw such heinous examples of in the 1864 election. The only penalty for stealing the states of Tennessee and Louisiana was forfeiture of those states in the congressional vote count. That penalty is not commensurate with the crime. Notice that Congress didn't even award the votes from those states to McClellan, which was a logical first step. But the penalties should have been far steeper than that. Fraud on that scale undercuts the entire democratic process and completely short-circuits the representative government. Therefore, it might be argued it is a form of treason. If the Constitution defined vote fraud as treason, the seriousness of the crime would be set, and all the penalties up to and including death would be in play. If that sounds harsh to you, there are other solutions, just as logical, that do not include death or even jail terms. In my opinion, the best solution in that case would have been to specify forfeiture of the entire election and a permanent ban from seeking public office at any level. This severe penalty would be reserved, of course, for only the most serious and widespread voter fraud. In the most serious cases like this, not only should the candidate be punished, his entire staff should be as well. All the top positions in the campaign staff should also be banned from ever taking part in an election down to the local level. As I said, if we want to address fraud, there are ways to do it, but the crime has to be taken seriously. If it isn't, we just encourage ever-increasing amounts of fraud. The companies that bankroll elections should also be brought into the penalties, and those penalties should be specified in writing and updated to address current needs. For example, in the recent propositions concerning genetically modified foods, several indications of vote manipulation were found, as well as campaign fraud. Monsanto and many other major companies were implicated. None of those indications of fraud were properly investigated. But even if they had been, the current penalties are only fines, which these companies simply write off as business expenses. We don't need bigger fines. We need to include any company guilty of voter fraud in the penalty box. Any company involved in vote or campaign fraud should be permanently banned from lobbying, campaign financing, or campaign advertising. Any effort to undermine that ban by channeling money through dummy companies, for instance, should be met with even stiffer penalties, up to and including liquidation of the company and seizing of all assets. I think you would admit that would put an end to the corruption we now see. If these sorts of penalties and methods were specified in the Constitution or adjoining documents, Congress would be immediately re-empowered. For example, rather than giving the Justice Department the option of investigating vote and campaign fraud, the Constitution could require it to do so, with specified penalties for not doing so. In that case, both Congress and the Supreme Court could be empowered to step in, applying these penalties against the Justice Department on a constitutional basis. Failure to investigate could be defined as obstruction of justice, and officials could be removed and permanently banned from public office on that basis. In the current system, not only is the regulation woefully inadequate, but the penalties, even when specified, are not commensurate to the crimes. This is because the criminals are the ones writing the legislation and doing the regulating. You will say that is just the way things are, but a more precise and extended constitution could have prevented the growth of fraud from the beginning. We have seen that in this case, and it can be discovered in many other major cases throughout American history, all the way back to the founding. And that is the end of Miles Mathis's article on the Lincoln assassination. Well, I would have to agree with him on this. It boils down to the simplest explanation. Why would they fake the Lincoln assassination? Well, he was sick, he was about to die, they had to be in control of the negotiations for the Civil War. That is the most simple and most sensical reason that I can just think of right off the bat. And Miles puts it pretty plainly. He was sick, he was about to die, if we are to believe that, and they knew that Johnson wouldn't be able to win on his own, so they put Lincoln in for the second term, and they killed him almost immediately. I mean, they fake killed him, however you want to say it. This stuff is so, once you understand how the machine works, it's so much easier to believe. The problem that most people have is they just can't believe that people wouldn't know that this was faked. And yet, things are faked all the time. Do people right now know exactly what's going on in Syria or any conflict area on the planet? No. You don't know anything about what's going on there. You know what the news tells you. Okay, what's your next best option? Okay, well, if you don't listen to the news or want to hear what they're reporting, okay, are there any independent journalists that you trust that are out there reporting on it? Okay, maybe there is, maybe there isn't. And then who else do you have to trust? The locals? Do you know anybody from these places? Or even in your own country? Let's make it more simple. in your own country? Do you know what's going on in the Capitol? Do you know everything that goes on except what you read in the newspapers? And then maybe you can call a friend that lives there and be like, hey, like, you live in the area, do you know anything about this? Oh, no, you know, I'm just, you know, I run a bakery, and I don't know anything about this, I just run a bakery here. So it's, you know, unless you're there, it's hard to know what went on in the Ford Theater. Could they control the entire event? Absolutely they can. They do it all the time now. Oh man, people really need to look into this stuff because it's so easy to figure out once you have the clues, and once you can just get your head around it. I don't know why it's so hard for some people to get their head around this. Does the government lie? Yes, they do. Everybody can agree that the government lies. They all know that the government lies. The government admits to lying. It's been caught lying. Everybody knows the government lies. Hey, hey man, did you know that the government lied about the Lincoln assassination? Oh, dude, you're crazy. Dude, you're crazy. Hey man, did you know the government lied about the Kennedy assassination? Yeah, dude, but come on. Come on. Everybody knows all the conspiracies that go on with the Kennedy assassination, so just pick one. Man, it works perfect. They even have a couple conspiracy theories for Lincoln, like, oh, you know, Booth, he survived and all this stuff. But all of the popular conspiracy theories on the Lincoln assassination is, oh, well, you know, it was, it's always layered. It's genius. The manipulation is so simple, but it's genius. Once the event happens, just create the legend of the event. Okay, so Lincoln got assassinated. How did it go down? Oh, it was a lone gunman. It was an actor who he leaped on the stage and he yelled about it, and then he ran off and they killed him in a barn later. It was just like, okay. Or the powerful people in control at that time needed to pull something off so that they could retain power. Okay, that seems a lot more likely. Okay, what do they need to do that? Okay, manufacture the event. How do they manufacture the event? Well, just spent 3 videos explaining it, and Miles Mathis puts it pretty plainly in his paper here. So, it's really not that difficult for anybody with common sense to just believe this goes on. The only people you're going to have a problem with are people that don't believe that the government is involved in lies and would lie to them. It's so weird. I don't know why people are so loyal to the government, and they have their favorite government people. They have their favorite presidents. All this stuff. I don't get into that anymore. I just read about their past. I just read who they're connected to and who is pulling their strings. It's very the rabbit hole goes very deep. But if you can understand that it's just a couple of simple concepts here, it's just. You're being lied to. The deceptions are... There's so many of them, but you can really cut down on your time looking into them if you just know which ones are false or not. All of the ones that are looking into, you know, whether Booth... there are people, and I have looked into the Booth conspiracy. Oh, he escaped. But it's hilarious because the whole thing... It was... I wouldn't say it was a complete waste of time because I still learned a few things, but the whole point of it is false because it never happened. It's so much more believable that John Wilkes Booth probably died before this even was said to have happened as an agent working in the war. Why would this famous guy want his name associated with this? Or he was just a part of the family and he went along with it because he's just a part of it. It was just his job. It was his turn to do. Or he got killed. Who knows? There's so many different options. This is what these people consider when they're putting together the plan. This is why you want to try to get into their heads. Okay, hey, how would they want to do this? Alright, well, let's look at the situation. Let's look at all the players and let's see what really happened. And what really happens is absolutely fascinating. People would love reading about this. They just don't know it exists. A lot of people are programmed to think that alternative theories of history or conspiracy theories are just a bunch of loony people who you would never want to talk to or associate with. Well, they're bringing up facts and evidence, so the people you might not want to be paying so much attention to are the people that are always lying to you. The mainstream media, the intelligence agencies, and the government. They've all been caught lying. They are not... You cannot depend on them for the truth, period. That doesn't mean that everybody with an alternative theory is telling the truth. Heck, a lot of them are paid by the government to get out there and just misdirect you. Who cares about, oh man, the theories out there that people have spent years... Think about this. People spend years... I know this guy who is obsessed with the Kennedy assassination. And he is all hung up on shooters here, there, wherever. But it's the whole thing was staged. If you can understand that, you can throw off years of chasing rabbits into different holes, man. So, I will leave it at that. Thanks for watching. I will see you in the next one.